Hello, my name is Dan Williams, and I'd like to welcome you to Intro to Ansible for Networkers. This is a basic beginner level Ansible one-on-one sort of course that I put together to take people that have some background in networking and introduce them to Ansible and how it can be used within the network. Before we get started, I'd like to go through a couple of housekeeping things. First, I want to go over a few basic assumptions. For this course, we assume that you have a basic understanding of routing and switching. We're going to be using Cisco in this course, but just understanding some basic Cisco commands and how you typically interact with Cisco devices would be handy. I'm going to be using Ubuntu for this demo, so a basic understanding of Ubuntu and just how to get around. We're not doing anything Ubuntu specific, mostly just using Vim and Ansible actually. So just so you know what you're looking at. And we're also assuming that there's no prior Ansible experience. We're going to be going through from a basic Ansible overview and the structure of Ansible to how we would run some basic commands on a Cisco device using Ansible. So this is a very entry level sort of introduction to the Ansible software. Now I'd like to go over what technology is actually being used in this presentation. We're going to be using Ansible 2.4.2, which is running on top of Python 2.7.6. The OS that I'm using, as I alluded to earlier, is Ubuntu 14.4.5. And the Cisco router we're going to be interacting with is actually an iOS virtual router running iOS 15.6.2T. I've got that iOS V router running actually in Viral, but it accepts the commands, and that's all we're really showing. We're not going to get into anything really device specific other than the commands we're running. So now let's start getting more into Ansible. I'd like to start with a quick Ansible overview of the project. The project was started in 2012 by Michael DeHaan, and Red Hat actually acquired the project in 2013. The project is still open source and can be found on GitHub at the link provided. Although it is owned by Red Hat, there's a very large open source community around this project. It has over 27,000 stars on GitHub, and there's over 3,000 contributors. The project is largely Python based and module driven, which means that each vendor or individuals, as you'll see as you start to get more and more into Ansible, can create modules that just plug into the Ansible framework and allow you to extend the possibilities of what you can actually do. And it's all driven through a YAML formatted configuration file, which makes it very human readable and very approachable. So even if you're a person that doesn't know Python, you can interact with those modules very easily through the structured YAML configuration that drives the entire Ansible framework. So as we start getting into how this actually works, I like to start with the inventory file because that really tells you, hey, this is what I'm going to be interacting with. The inventory file is used, like I said, to specify the devices that you're going to be working on. And within that inventory file, you can have just a list of devices, or you can create groups of devices, depending on, all your routers are in this group, all your switches are in this group. Let's say everything that's in a certain region is in a group, things like that. There's a default directory that you can see here, the etc Ansible hosts, and that's also an example file. So if you want, after you have your Ansible installed, you can go look at that file and see how it's all set up. And we're going to look at a file here shortly. But most people use a specific file that's contained within the directory that they're currently working in and creating their playbooks in. And if you were to run that playbook from the command line like we'll do later on, you can specify exactly which inventory file you want to use using -i. The file can either be in INI format or YAML format. INI is the default format, and that's what we're going to use in this course because, like I said, it's the default, and just to keep things basic since we're all just starting off here. Here's an example of the INI format inventory file. As you see, I've got a mix of host names, IP addresses, things like that. So there's a default of all as we get deeper into this. So you don't see a lot of any repeats in this list, but we'll go through some more details on that. I just wanted you to see how the default INI file format is. It's very straightforward. In the brackets, that's the group headings. So if you were to call group routers, it would only call router 2 and router 3, group switches, that. And if you were to call all, it would call everything in this file. I want to talk some about variables. Now, some of this is going to sound a little technical, but we're going to go through it and show how you actually interact with this in the live hands-on demo. But I want to just get a base level of knowledge so you won't be totally caught off guard and be like, whoa, how did those variables get injected into this entire process? So Ansible is very aware of the file structure where the playbook is situated in the folders available to it. So group variables would be a variable that you want to apply to everything you're running the playbook against. As you'll see, everything that we're doing in the demo is located in the Ansible 101 folder. So whenever group variables are automatically imported, Ansible looks for a group vars directory. And inside that directory, for our example, we'll have just a file named all. And within that file, we'll have the variables that we want to apply to the whole running of the playbook. The directory, like I said, is located in the root of your playbook folder, and you'll see more of that as we go through this. I just, like I said, didn't want anyone to be surprised. Then you have individual host variables. Same basic structure. Inside my Ansible 101 folder, I've got a host vars folder, and in there I have files that are named for each of the hosts in the inventory. So in our inventory for the demo that you're going to be seeing, we're going to have router 1, router 2, and router 3. So inside of that host vars directory, there's 3 files, router 1, router 2, and router 3. And that'll contain things that are individual to that host. So some group variables may be your DNS servers. So all the DNS are domain name servers that you want to apply to all of your routers and switches. That would be a group var. But individual IP addresses for interfaces, for instance, or host names, things like that, that's a host-specific host var that would go in an individual host var file. Now that we've talked about host variables, let's go into modules. So Ansible has a built-in module library, and it also allows users to write custom modules. And modules are the pieces of information or the program that actually does work inside of the playbook. Modules, like it says here, usually take a set of arguments and key value format, and that's how you pass information into these modules so they know how to act and what to act upon. And they return data to the playbook for keeping documentation or to continue running through the playbook so that it can be acted upon by other modules or tasks within that playbook. And that data is usually returned in JSON format. And a big thing you'll hear as you start going through Ansible is idempotence. That means that if a change doesn't need to be made, then it shouldn't be made. Just making changes for the sake of making changes is not part of how modules should act. So a module should be able to look, see if what you're wanting to do is already done, not making any changes if they're not required. The first module we're going to talk about is the set fact module. This is a utility module, and it allows you to set a new variable inside the playbook itself. These variables are set on a host by host basis as you go through the playbook. If you have a playbook that's running on multiple hosts, as most of you will. And these variables are also available to other plays, as the playbook runs. So it's not just a one use sort of thing. As you go play to play, this will be available as long as the playbook's alive. And a lot of people ask about variable precedence. We're really not going to get into that, but there's some very good documentation on the Ansible website around that. So I've put an example on the right, and it's where we define a provider. So we call the set fact, and you'll see this is the YAML formatting and the spacing and how everything's called out. So we call the set fact module. Under it, we name the variable that we're creating. We're calling this provider, and provider is something that we'll use to store our login credentials for these demo playbooks we're going to be running in this course. It doesn't have to be named provider. We usually do that in some of these courses for ease of understanding, but it can be named anything as you need to get more specific as you continue down this Ansible journey. In this, you'll see the double curly braces with inventory host name in it. That is actually this set fact module using a variable of whatever inventory item we're on in that playbook. So if it's router 01, host would be router 01, and that would dynamically be added. Username and password, and then, which in our case for the labs that we're going to be going through, Cisco, and auth pass is your enabled password. So in the case of this, it's Cisco as well. Then we go into the iOS command module. This allows you to run any command you want to on an iOS device, show commands, things like that. And I want to put that within bounds. As you'll see the last bullet, you can't run configuration commands. So anything that you don't have to get into config T mode for, you can run that command, do your show commands, things like that. So you can also set a wait for, as you see in the example. I'm kind of jumping around the bullets, but as you see in the example, this wait for, it allows you to look within the feedback that the module is getting from the iOS device to make sure it contains certain things. So in this show version example, we're going into iOS command, which is our module, and under that we're given a provider, which is what we talked about in the set fact module. We're saying, hey, this is the device you're acting upon. This is the login credentials for that device. The command we're passing is show version. That's like you type in the literal command that you want to run on the device. And I'm looking in the results, and it's a JSON object, the result that it gets back. So I'm looking in the first section of those results. And I'm just looking for it to contain iOS. In this case, we're acting upon iOS devices. So we want to make sure that they're iOS devices. If I could have put contains NXOS or any sort of identifying information I want to verify before we continue through the playbook. Because if it's not an iOS device, a lot of the plays really wouldn't act properly and they would just end up failing anyway. So we might as well verify now using this. And we'll get more into that as we go into Playbook Structure. The next module we're going to look at is iOS config. This is the module that allows you to run configuration commands on iOS devices. You'll see, I'll go ahead and start walking through the example. The name, and on these, the name is just something that means something to you. So that as you see the output, when you run the playbook, you can go, oh, I know exactly what that is. So we have our name. This one is create a test access list. We call the iOS config module. Again, we send the provider. Authorize yes. This means this is letting the module know that we have to go into enabled mode in this iOS device. So that's what the authorize yes means. Then you see the lines that we want to pass in the configuration. We're creating a 2-line access list, line 10, line 20. Parents, so when you're configuring this by hand, you know that before you can add these lines, you have to go into IP access list extended test. We have to go into that mode before we can add the lines. And that's what the parent is. If this were an interface, the parent would be interface gigabit 00, things like that. And before I actually want to delete this access list, I want this access, this is a very deterministic. I want this access list to be exactly like it is in this list. So if somebody had come in and created this list previously, I don't care. They should, I want to blow it away, recreate it exactly like it looks in this play right here. So that pretty much covers what we're looking at in this example. If you go into the actual module documentation for the iOS config module and on the Ansible website, there are a lot of other options, but this is a high level look at the iOS config module. Now we're going to look at the register conditional and debugging within a playbook. The register conditional allows you to capture output and save it as a variable. So if you look at the example, we're running iOS command and we're doing a show run NTP. So you see the command that I'm passing would be the exact command I want to type into the CLI, which is a show run pipe include NTP. I do have to be, since it's a show run, I have to be in enabled mode. So I do an authorize yes. And then I want to capture whatever JSON objects returned, and I'm going to save it in a variable named after NTP. And then I want to actually look at that. When I'm running the playbook, maybe I'm in my playbook design mode or I'm learning and I want to see exactly what it's sending back. I can do a debug inside the playbook and say the variable that I actually want to print out and show is after NTP and the standard output lines. And it'll just print that as the playbook runs. And after you are comfortable with what you're getting, or you're seeing the feedback you want to see, you can comment that out or get rid of it. But it really is helpful as you are designing your playbook. And as we're talking about playbooks, let's actually get into the playbook structure. I like to look at it as there's three high-level pieces of information that go into a playbook, and of course, as you continue down this Ansible journey, just like anything, the rabbit hole gets deeper and deeper, right? But to start off, we provide host information, we provide what device to connect from, and a list of tasks or plays to be run on that device. So it's pretty much the modules that we put together, creating the tasks, using those modules, putting them in a list and that's what creates the playbook. So let's look at this playbook example. This is a very short one, and as we get into the hands-on piece, we'll get deeper and deeper into this. But at the very beginning, standard YAML format, we got the 3 dashes to start. The hosts, we're going for all. So whatever inventory file you specify, or if you're using the default inventory file, you can choose, if you have it broken into groups, you can put what group you would like to act upon in the hosts, or I've chosen all for this. Gather facts is something we can cover later on in a more advanced topic, but gathered facts for now set to no. And the connection is going to be local, which means that we actually want to make the connection to the iOS devices that we're acting upon from the local machine where we're running the playbook. We don't have some remote device that we're proxying through or a jump box setup. We're just running it from the local device. Then we get down into our tasks, and that's where we put in those modules that we discussed earlier. The first thing we want to do is we want to set that provider fact so that we know the credentials that we're going to use to log into these devices. Now, you're probably like, well, Dan, it's not very safe to keep all your credentials in plain text. And it's true. There are different ways that you can handle credentials inside of Ansible. This is the one we're going to use for this course because it shows you, what's going on and gets you into it. So now that we have that provider variable defined, we can start moving into our tasks that interact with the device. Since we know how to interact with that device. And then this is the show version using the iOS command module that we discussed earlier. And these just continue on and on. This playbook right here would do a show version on the devices in your inventory. And if it's an iOS device, it'd say okay. If it's not, it'd throw an error and that's it. But this playbook could be run. So now that we've gone through some introduction to the modules, what an example playbook looks like, let's get into more of the hands-on piece of it and actually showing how we can interact with these things, through Ansible. All right, so here we are on my Ubuntu machine. We're in my Ansible 101 directory, and let's look and see what's in here. So I've got my host vars directory, my group vars directory. You'll see I've already got about 4 playbooks written, my reset lab playbook, of course, and my inventory files. So first, let's start with the inventory. Give it a look real quick, and I've got router 1, router 2, and router 3. I apologize for the formatting. Very straightforward. I actually have these devices entered into my hosts file so that it resolves the IP address. But that's my inventory file, nothing fancy. I've got 3 iOS V routers out there. They have some servers attached to them because we're going to do some configuration, ping a server, and do some verification. The next, we'll look at our group vars. So we have the all file in there, and we can look at that real quick. In here, it's just the NTP server. So I want to use that same NTP server for all of the devices that I'm going to have, that I'm going to run these plays against. So that would be a group var because it's the same for everything. Now, if we look at our host vars, I have a host vars file for each device because host vars, like I said, are specific for each one. So let's take a look at at one of these. All right, so I've got a specific IP address for gigabit 01, and then the attached server IP, because we're going to configure this IP address onto gigabit 01 of that router, and then we want to know what server we're going to ping. So that's different for each one. It's 10.1.1.1 for the interface IP for router 1. For router 2, it's 10.2.2.1, so on and so forth. So let's look at playbook number 1 and see what we're going to do. So, all right, this one's a very straightforward one. It looks a lot like the example we went through in the slides. We're going for all the hosts in the inventory file. We're connecting from this local machine to those devices. I define the provider just like we did in the slide deck. And then we're just going to run a show version. And then we're going to register show version. We're going to register the output we get back as the variable name version. Then we're going to use debug to show what that information looks like. All right, so to run this playbook, we type Ansible Playbook -I in our inventory file, and then the name of the playbook, so course playbook1.yaml. All right, so define the provider for all 3 of the routers. Let me scroll up here. It defined the playbook for all 3 of the routers. Then it ran the show version command, and it went OK on all of them. And then here's the debug. Version, which is the variable we registered the output to, the standard output lines, and here's the show version for each one. So that's for router 1, this is for router 2, and here's router 3. We didn't change anything, all 3 ran okay. So that's wonderful. So let's take a look at, so that's really standard. Hey, we need to collect show version on a bunch of stuff. You just run that against the inventory, boom, show version. Now let's look at playbook number 2. So on this one, we're doing the provider, we're doing the show version, and like we looked at in the slides, we're verifying that these are iOS devices. So if we get this far and there was a device in there that wasn't an iOS device, it would kick it out. Then we're going to look at our show access list. We're going to see if there's an access list named test. Again, we're registering that output as before ACL. We're going to look at that. Then we're actually going to create an access list using that module that we looked at, the iOS config module example that we looked at in the slides. And then we're going to show that that's been created. So let's run this one real quick, then we'll walk through a couple of things about it. So we're just going to go back here and change this to 2. Again, Ansible-Playbook-I, the name of our inventory file, and then our playbook. Hit enter. All right, define provider, did the show version, everything checked out all right. We see no ACLs exist. We see no ACLs exist here in the first debug. Then we created them. Here it is, create the test access list. Sorry, got a little jumpy there on me. Then we run our show access list test again, and we see that the access list has been created on each one. We see the change. All our tests came out okay, and that's fine. Something I want to do on this one to show you how it errors out if something's different, right? With the show version. So let's just go into Vim on Playbook 2 real quick. We'll run down here to where it contains iOS, and we'll just change this to XE, right? Save it. We're going to run the exact same thing again. Define the provider, run the show version. Boom, errored out. One or more conditional statements have not been satisfied. It failed on that one. Boom, and you'll see that it creates this retry file. So if we look at that, it tells you the host that it failed on. So if you need to make some adjustments and then run this playbook again against only the host that it failed on, you can use that as your inventory file. It's just a good little thing to know. So now we've created these access lists. We know that they exist. Let's look at playbook number 3 and I'm going to show a little more verification stuff on it. So cat course playbook 3. So on this one, again, provider, we're doing our show version check. It's just something I like to have in there, or some sort of verification, make sure we're barking up the right tree. Then we're doing a show run on our interfaces, and each of these routers have the same setup interface wise. So we're looking at the configuration on interface gig 01. So we're doing that show run using iOS command, going into enabled mode, and then we're registering that as before so that we can do debug and see that output. Then we're going to add an IP, and this is where we're looking at that gigabit Ethernet 01 IP variable that we defined in the host vars file. So there'll be a different one for each device, and it plugs it right in the line here in between those curly braces. Then it does a no shut because the interface is shut. And here's that parent that we discussed whenever we were talking about the access list. I said, anytime you have to go into a subcommand structure like that, just like if we were going to configure an interface, we know if we were typing this by hand, we have to go into interface gigabit 01. So that is the parent. Then we're going to do the show run interface again, and we're going to register the after interface just to see the configuration. And then we're going to ping using iOS command. We're going to ping that attached server, and we're going to wait for it. We're going to make sure the result contains the exclamation point so we know that it's good to go. So this has got some good steps to it. We're going through, we're making sure we're on an iOS device. We're checking our interface config. We're adding an IP address. We're no-showing the interface, and we're verifying we can ping what's attached to it. This is all just iterating using just a couple of basic modules to get the logic working in your head. So let's I'll just type this out. Ansible Playbook -I inventory for our inventory file, and course Playbook 3. All right, all things we've seen before, and we'll go through this here in just a second. It added the IP address. We see the IP right there. And then it was able to ping everything. We got an OK on that. So let's scroll up. First, we see our interfaces. No IP address. Shut down on each router. Boom, boom. Then it adds the IP. It changes it. We do the show run interface again. You see here, router 1. It added that 10.1.1. Router 2, boom. Router 3. And then it runs that ping test. It gives us an OK. That means it saw that exclamation point in the output. So that's good stuff. The next one, I want to show you a little idiosyncrasies, give you a heads up just to show you how some things work a little differently in using the iOS config command. Some things to keep in mind as you move forward and start to investigate more advanced ways to solve these problems. So let's look at playbook number 4. So in this one, we're going down through here. We're going to do a show run NTP, see if there's an NTP that exists. We're going to add the NTP server from the group vars because it's the same for each one, and then make sure that it's configured afterwards. So very straightforward playbook. So let's do this. Ansible Playbook -I inventory. Then we're going to do course Playbook 4. Get my mouse out of the way. No NTP servers. Added it. All right. So now our NTP server's in there. Now we talked about this being about these playbooks and how they run. So let's say we wanted to change this NTP server. We go into this playbook and we'd be like, okay, all we got to do is, I'm going to actually go in here and actually, you know what? I'm going to go into the group vars file. So going to group vars all, we're going to change this to be 22.22. Okay. Oh, we got to update everything. We're good to go. We got to do that. So let's run this playbook again. and it should replace it, right? Doing our before check. No, it just added a second NTP server. And the reason that it just added another NTP server is because the iOS command module acts just as if a person were typing that command into the command line. So you have to take that into account. There's no logic built into the iOS command module just by default to handle the intent, right? You intended to replace it, but it just ran the command. So you could have run a before command to wipe out all the NTP servers, and then whenever it ran with the new variable, it replaced it just like we do with the access list. But there are new declarative modules being added to Ansible that handle things like this and drive that more intent-based approach. And I definitely encourage you to look into those as you start to go into more advanced topics. Now, I'd like to say thank you for taking the time to view this introduction to Ansible for networkers. I hope you found it useful. I've put all the playbooks and actually the viral topology I used and things like that up on my GitHub that can be found at the link below. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me uh, through a GitHub issue. I also have my information on there for Twitter. I'm Dan C. Williams. So if you have any questions, I'm always here, and I appreciate you taking the time. Thanks and have a great day.